Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's episode of Fearfully and Wonderfully Me. Today's episode is all about self-worth and identity. And I think it's important to talk about this because a lot of times we don't really think about intentionally creating our identity, right? Nobody can create your identity except you. But the problem is that most of us allow our identity to be created or influenced by external forces, and we don't stop to think about intentionally creating that on purpose based on our values. We don't really control creating our identity. A lot of times we just let it kind of happen by default. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. It's just realizing that when we intentionally influence and create and shape our identity based on our values and who we are, it really ties down directly to our sense of self-worth. So I want to dig down into that just a little bit. Because my point here is to help you realize that who you want to be is something that you get to determine. And if you don't determine your identity, other things and other people will. So it really comes down to, intentionally choosing who and what we want to become. And it's powerful when we realize that that is so possible. So let me give you an example. When we create our identity around solid values and principles of growth, it gives us a solid sense of who we are and how we behave, and the confidence to be authentically ourselves. And that means that we don't have to worry about filtering that in different situations, right? So it gives us confidence because we know intentionally who we are and who we want to be. We know our values. And it gives us a strong sense of self-worth in different situations. So because, I think I've touched on this before, there really are two types of self-confidence. There is self-confidence in what we know how to do, our competencies, our skills. And then there's self-confidence in who we are as a person, our character. So the first one, confidence in our skills and our competencies, is situational confidence. So, for example, I don't have any situational confidence doing heart surgery. You would not want me to do heart surgery on you. I don't have any confidence in that. I don't have those skills, that ability. But who I am as a person doesn't change whether I'm visiting an operating room or recording a podcast like this or anything else, right? That's confidence in myself and who I am. So really, when you stop to think about that sense of self-worth, that confidence in who you are and your identity has got to be centered on something lasting, something permanent, because that means it's gonna be stable for you in different situations throughout the storms of life. You're gonna have confidence in that identity. It's a center, if you want to call it that. It's a centering. It's founding who you are, intentionally choosing that, and knowing that it's going to stay with you, that's not going to change in the short term. So the reason it's important is, a lot of times when we think about our self-worth, we judge ourselves in the moment, right? And the reason that's important to note is that a single point in time doesn't show a trend. It doesn't show any potential. So when we think about our self-worth or the lack of self-worth, and we look at where we are today or who we are today, it's easy to beat ourselves up for not being where we want to be or who we want to be, or anything. It's easy to beat ourselves up for not looking the way we want to look, or I'm feeling like I'm not good enough or not skinny enough or smart enough or whatever. And so it's easy to take what is today and beat ourselves up for it if we haven't intentionally created that identity. But a single moment in time doesn't show potential. It can't show an upward trend of you growing and becoming your best self. You're the best version of you, because it's just one moment. It's just one point. And our actions don't create our identity, or don't equal identity, I suppose is a better way to say that. But they can help influence it. I like to say belief drives behavior. What you believe about yourself and your identity and your self-worth is going to heavily influence what you do. So, for example, I'm heavily influenced in what I do by my belief in myself and my calling. For example, I read a lot of books because I'm always looking to learn. I'm always looking for new things to share with you, like on this podcast and through my blogs and books. And so that belief in my calling and that part of my identity drives behavior. So I read a lot, I learn a lot, I focus on, thinking through things before I put them in a blog and sharing them, the motivational quotes I put out. So it's just an example to share with you of what you believe about yourself and your identity is going to heavily influence what you do. So, years ago when I was still at home and I was still living with my parents and still going through that terrible abuse and that situation, there was just so much shame in my life, and I really didn't know how to cope with what was going on and what was happening to me. And, I kind of just tried to not think about it. And I know that sounds crazy, but I just didn't know what to do with it. There was just so much shame around it, and I felt so dirty and didn't know how to deal with all of those emotions. And just, struggling emotionally to handle the abuse that I was experiencing from my father. And, compounding that was the deception, right? So there was the person, the public Ria that I like to say, that who my family and friends thought I was, that person. And then there was the shameful Ria, who lived with her father sexually abusing her. And then there was the desperate Ria, right, who's struggling to just manage all this and find some sort of normal life. And my coping mechanism back then became food. And I really, growing up, we didn't really have a lot of emphasis in our household on healthy nutrition and that kind of thing. But I just went to the extreme in order to cope. And I remember sneaking up entire boxes of cake icing and, those pound boxes of confectioner sugar or brown sugar, and just eating that stuff with a spoon. And, it tasted good and it made me feel good, even if it was just for a moment. But I started to create that as a coping mechanism, and it starts to influence my identity, because I was creating an identity centered around what felt good right then, right? And everyone now, we know, I certainly know now how bad sugar is for us, even a little bit. And here I was eating entire boxes of the stuff. But it tasted good and it made me feel good. And so, not surprisingly, I started to gain weight. And what was interesting is when my father, he took me and signed me up for a local gym, and it was a local gym there that had classes for just women only. So it was one of the things that he approved of me doing. And he really didn't know about the food that I was turning to in order to just numb my emotional pain. But something happened when I started going to take those classes. For the first time in my life, I realized that I had some control over my physical body, even if it was just an hour a day. And it was incredibly liberating, because it gave me a different foundation for some of my identity. So suddenly, instead of basing my identity around, oh, this feels good in the moment. I don't have to worry about the long-term consequences. I now started to influence my identity around someone who was a little bit healthier, who had control of her physical body and environment. And that's based on a principle, right? If we eat healthier foods in the right amounts, we start to look and feel better. And that doesn't matter if we're pear-shaped or apple-shaped or whatever. It's a principle that if we eat junk food all the time, we are not going to be the best version of ourselves physically. But the exercise made me feel stronger. It made me feel better about myself. And so it kind of became like a competition for myself when I realized I could finish the whole class. I had to build up the strength to do that. And all of that started leading to better eating habits. And I started to turn away from using the food and the sugar as a coping mechanism. And exercise was a much better coping mechanism. And because it's more principle centered, right? Because ultimately, most exercise isn't very comfortable for the body, and we know that. Now, we can enjoy exercise because we know we're reaping the benefits, but let's be honest, it's not comfortable to get all sweaty and out of breath. It's just not, and our physical bodies don't like to be uncomfortable, right? It's just a fact of being human. And so our physical body tries to keep us from, getting into that state, and so it tells our mind, hey, this is hard, this isn't any fun. But we have to just realize that the long-term benefits outweigh the short-term discomfort. And when we can get comfortable in that state, then we're helping to create an identity based around self-discipline. And we'll talk about that in some of the later elements. We'll drill down a little bit more into that. But so my point here is that when we start to intentionally think about who we are and our identity, then we start to increase our sense of self-worth, because we are intentionally choosing who I want to be and not just drifting through the day or drifting through the year or the life, right? We're actually thinking about that and being on purpose. You've heard the phrase, I think it's based on Rick Warren's book, The Purpose-Driven Life. And so what I'm talking about here is creating your identity on purpose, who you want to be, because founding your sense of identity on solid success principles is always going to serve you better than the alternative, the default. Now, my choices aren't your choices, and I'm not telling you what choices you should make. But what I am saying is you get to choose the person that you will become, and your results in life will be based on the choices that you make. So the only question is then is, who do you want to be? Until next time.
Start increasing your influence and maximizing your potential with the Ria's audiobooks. Available at audible.com, amazon.com, and iBooks. Please visit riastory.com to learn about Ria's books, resources, speaking, and training programs. Thanks for listening.